few ships can claim to have had quite the same career as the armored cruiser Georgios Averof. She would see combat against superior forces on 2 separate occasions, and in both cases, she would drive the enemy off. She did so functionally single-handed as well, with her Greek comrades far too slow to keep up. For an armored cruiser to drive off battleships, even if those battleships were older, is rare enough as it is. For her to do it on her own, that is even more impressive. And this was just her first war in a career that would last for 40 years and span both world wars. Such is her fame in Greece that she is sometimes called, albeit incorrectly, a battleship. If nothing else, that should tell you exactly what her feats mean to her homeland. And, of course, she remains the only armored cruiser to survive to the modern day, one of only a handful of ships of her time period to survive, along with such illustrious names as Mikasa, Texas, and Aurora. For all of this, though, the ship that entered service was already arguably obsolete upon arrival, and would, for most of her later career, be an outdated relic pushed past what anyone else would have used her for. Let's take a look at that, shall we? The Greece of the early 20th century was a far cry from the heights of power that older Greek states had reached. Long gone were the days of Athens dominating the sea, or the Spartans, overrated though they may be, dominating on land. The days of Alexander or the Eastern Roman Empire were just as long gone. Greeks had languished under foreign, in this case Turkish, rule for centuries. Even after breaking free, Greece would still be a small and poor nation, a middle power at absolute best, and then only in comparison to their rivals in the Ottoman Empire. As such, it should not be a surprise that the Royal Hellenic Navy was largely outdated, with what few ships they possessed being old and slow. Their 3 quote-unquote battleships were only a couple decades old, but already increasingly obsolete. Some modern, if admittedly small, destroyers gave a certain punch to the fleet, but these were hardly enough. Arrayed against the Greeks, after all, was the Ottoman Navy. While this had also declined from its own greatest heights, it remained larger than the Greek fleet and possessed more modern ships. For a certain value of modern, when their newest battleships were the first German pre-dreadnoughts, bought by the Ottomans as the Germans expanded their own fleet. Still, compared to the Greek ships, which were more ironclad than pre-dreadnought, it was not something that could be ignored, especially when control of the Aegean was critical in any conflict between the ancient enemies. It was at this point that the Italians entered the picture. Italy, themselves rapidly building up and modernizing the Regia Marina, had laid down 3 new armored cruisers in the form of the Pisa class. Some of the last of the kind, with battle cruisers entering into the equation, these were still powerful ships, and arguably among the best armored cruisers ever designed. As it was, though, Italy was pushing their naval budget to the breaking point, and the third of the class was deemed surplus to requirements. The Greeks, looking for a modern capital ship of any description, swept in at this point. However, if Italy was straining her naval budget, Greece would have been breaking theirs attempting to purchase this ship. It was fortunate for the Greeks that they wouldn't have to use their entire naval budget on one ship, because the Greeks were looking at this Italian cruiser in the early 20th century. She was laid down by the Italians in 1907. However, several years earlier, a wealthy Greek businessman had passed away in 1899. So wealthy, and such a patriot in fact, that he had donated £300,000 to the Greek Navy in his will. The Greeks had evidently decided to save these funds for a rainy day, as they did not use them on the aforementioned destroyers, and instead used those funds to pay for the down payment on the new cruiser. This man's name would thus be attached to the cruiser forever. She would be named Georgios Averof in his honor, and as a thank you for the money he had left the Navy. With funding and a name now secured, the new cruiser continued her construction, now under Greek ownership. As mentioned, she was laid down in 1907. With a new owner that would actually finish her, she would be launched on March 12, 1910, and commissioned on May 16, 1911. Now, once again, it is worth noting that by 1911, armored cruisers were very much old news. Battle cruisers were the new thing in the great navies, and had firmly eclipsed the ships they originated from. This was, however, the great navies. Greece was not by any stretch a great navy, and aspirations to the contrary aside, nor were the Ottomans. Avarov was not a battleship, no, but she was faster than any ships the Turks could muster, and her main battery outranged even the old pre-dreadnoughts. For the Greeks, Avarov was by no means obsolete or outdated, which is a fine point to segue into her technical details, as they are relevant now. As launched, Avarov was equipped with what could be considered a semi-dreadnought style of gun layout, this on a hull of about 9,950 tons. Her main battery consisted of 2 twin turrets, one on either end of the ship, equipped with 9.2-inch, 234mm cannon. This is in contrast to her Italian sisters, which were instead equipped with 10-inch guns. These 4 guns were of British origin, one of the quirks of Avarov's design. Her secondary battery was 8 7.5-inch, 190mm guns, mounted in 4 twin turrets, 2 on either side of the ship in classic wing mountings. These were, in contrast to her main battery, the same guns fitted to her Italian sister ships. Rounding out her design loadout were 16 3-inch, 76mm, and 4 47mm anti-torpedo boat guns, alongside 3 submerged torpedo tubes. For an armored cruiser, this was actually a fairly hefty broadside. She was right in line with the final generation of armored cruisers in other navies, with the exception of the largest ones like the American and Japanese ships. Her armor was similarly impressive for the type, at 7.9 inches, 200mm at its thickest. This was thicker than most armored cruisers. It was, in fact, thicker than any battlecruiser prior to Lion, discounting the Germans obviously, and coming up on light battleship scale protection. For further context, that's only a couple millimeters shy of Congo, generally considered one of the best battlecruisers built. While her speed was much more lacking compared to battlecruisers, at 23.5 knots at her best, Avarov was still quite handily outpacing the Turkish capital ships, and would put that speed to good use and service. To round this off, I'll note that Avarov was an interesting mix of technology. Her hull was Italian, her guns, even the secondary battery, were British in design and construction, and her generators were German. This interesting mix of tech was matched by a forward-thinking fitting of a foremast, which her Italian sisters lacked on commissioning. And with her technical details finished for the moment, we can get to her service. I know it took a bit to get here, but I think her background was worth covering in greater detail. So, let's get to the service history. As mentioned, she was commissioned in 1911. Her first mission, such as it was, would be to sail off to the coronation review of George V in Britain. This would not prove to be an auspicious start for Avarov, as she proceeded to run aground on June 19th and had to be put in dry dock to repair the damage. Her crew, perhaps going a bit stir-crazy, ended up getting into a brawl with the locals. Apparently over blue cheese of all things, which I guess just means this crew took their food very seriously. In any case, with her captain relieved for being unable to control his crew, she returned to Greece under the careful hand of a much more effective skipper. One that would drill his crew relentlessly to restore discipline, though with the caveat that he refrained from gunnery practice, as all the cruiser's ammunition had to come from Britain, which was not cheap. This fact does make her later performance all the more impressive when you think about it. Returning to Greek waters by September of 1911, Avarov promptly became an item of some concern for Ottoman naval commanders. She, alone, was more effective than any combination of other ships in the Greek fleet, and was arguably the most powerful warship in the Aegean, when you take into account her combination of speed, armor, and firepower. I grant you, the Ottoman battleships had heavier broadsides and armor, but they were far slower and unable to react as well to changing conditions. This fact would be famously driven home a year later when the First Balkan War began. Avarov, with her old captain now an admiral, would see 2 major actions against the Ottoman Navy. These were the Battle of Ely in December 1912 and the Battle of Limnos in January 1913. In both cases, Avarov would be the flagship of the Greek fleet. And in both cases, she would, out of understandable frustration at how slow the rest of the fleet was, sail off and act independently of her supporting forces. At Ely, the Ottomans would sortie out against the Greek fleet, led by their old battleships. There may or may not have been taunting by telegram involved prior to this, though I have not seen a source cited on the quotes I've seen. Regardless, the Ottomans, with their ex-German pre-dreadnoughts in the lead, clashed with the Greek fleet. Or, if you prefer, they clashed with Avarov alone. The Greek admiral, again, was frustrated at the lack of speed of the old ironclads, so he promptly hoisted a flag for independent action, ran Avarov up to a speed of around 20 knots, and charged off to cross the T of the Ottoman fleet. Avarov, which let's remember had not done gunnery practice, opened fire on the Turkish flagship. The ex-German battleship would be hit multiple times, sending the Ottoman fleet into disarray. Avarov continued to pour fire into the Ottoman fleet, accurate fire at that, which prompted the Turkish fleet to retreat. Avarov chased them off with the aid of the new Greek destroyers, sending them running from the field of battle. While no Ottoman ships were sunk, the Greeks had taken no damage in return. A similar result would follow at the Battle of Lemnos, where, once again, Avarov would break away from her consorts and fight the Ottomans solo. The difference here, though, is that this came after the entire fleets had fought it out. The old ironclad Mesudi was heavily damaged by the nearly as old Greek battleships. Meanwhile, the Ottoman flagship was pounded by Avarov again, including a hit to her central turret that killed her gun crew. Further hits to her superstructure caused issues with smoke that dropped her speed to 5 knots, prompting her sister ship to take command and the Ottoman fleet to withdraw. It was at this point that Avarov took off on her own again, where she would, through her speed and maneuverability, chase the Ottomans off and use guns on both sides of the ship to fire on the retreating enemy. At one point, she closed to around 5,000 yards, which goes to show both how confident the Greeks were and how poor the Ottoman gunnery was, as Avarov took no damage in this engagement and was only driven off by coastal artillery. At this point, though, the Ottoman fleet was spent. They could make no further attempts to uproot the Greeks, ceding control of the Aegean for the rest of the war. This Greek control of the sea probably had dire consequences on the Ottoman war effort. Certainly, in light of her successes, the Greeks thought so. Avarov received the nickname of Lucky Uncle George at this point. All of that being said, though, she would not quite see that kind of action ever again. The Second Balkan War was short, and a land-based conflict as Bulgaria didn't have a navy to speak of. And the Great War? Well, Greece was neutral for the majority of that conflict. A neutral that couldn't make up its mind on who to support, torn in two directions by the king and the prime minister. Such was this conflict of interests that after riots in Athens in 1916, Avarov was seized by the French. The French wouldn't make any real use of her, though, and she would be returned in 1917 when Greece formally joined the war on the Allied side. Again, though, there wasn't much use for her to really do at this point, as the Ottoman fleet was largely confined to ports by that point in the war. Her next major moment of fame would be as part of the occupation of Constantinople after the war ended, which for the Greeks was a moment of intense joy and pride. Their flagship, their pride and joy, had been able to sail as a victor into the Queen of Cities. Unfortunately for the Greeks, this moment of triumph would lead into the Greco-Turkish War in 1919. That mess deserves a video of its own, or several, but for the moment, what matters is that the Turkish fleet was still a non-entity, so Avarov's role was limited to shore bombardment, troop landings, and helping to evacuate refugees. With Greece financially ruined by the war, Avarov was largely confined to port in the immediate aftermath. By 1925, though, it was fairly clear she was in desperate need of a refit. Leaving aside, for the moment, general wear and tear, she was thoroughly outdated at this point. And while the new Republic of Turkey wasn't going to be going on a naval spending spree, they did still ostensibly have the ex-German battlecruiser Yavuz in inventory. Not really capable of even sailing at that point in time, but still there, and potentially able to be brought back into service with a major rebuild of her own. So, with funding put together, Avarov was sent off to France in 1925 for refit. This would last until 1927, and, among other things, saw her fitted with new anti-aircraft weaponry and her torpedo tubes removed. Furthermore, she was fitted with a new tripod foremast and conning tower, with the addition of new fire control equipment. Her boilers and engines were also overhauled, though notably not replaced by oil-fired equivalents. That was considered a step that was a bit too expensive in light of her age, so Avarov remained a coal-burning ship for the remainder of her career. The rest of the 1920s, and indeed the 1930s, would be fairly slow for her. Greece wasn't exactly getting up to foreign adventures at that point. As such, she mostly lingered on with training duties and the odd port visit. One such port visit would be on May 20th, 1937, when she sailed for Britain once again. Another coronation review, this time for George VI, would see Avarov as the only warship present that had been at the previous review for his father. This was noted by George himself, as he made a point acknowledging the captain and crew of the old cruiser. Following this, the aging cruiser returned to her peacetime duties, until Italy decided they rather wanted Greece for their new empire. This began in 1940, though the Greeks would initially see great success at pushing the Italians back. Then the Germans got involved, and everything fell apart. By April 18, 1941, Greece was collapsing, and the Greek government ordered Avarov, by this point falling apart from lack of proper maintenance, scuttled. Her crew and captain looked at those orders, said, "No, I don't think so," and proceeded to set sail. They took axes to a closed harbor boom to open an exit, and set off. Such was the speed of their retreat that their captain had to board her by a rope ladder when his ship was already underway. The Greeks would later appreciate this action, though at the time, it was a brazen defiance of orders. Regardless, Avarov set sail. First for Crete, where the Greek military and government had retreated, and then from there to Egypt, as the Germans continued their attack on the island. In this, the old cruiser dodged air attacks that sank many, much more modern, warships. She would reach Egypt on April 23rd, somewhat worse for wear, but intact. Alas, she was something of a mess. Her boilers were so worn out, even after the 1920s refit, that she could only manage a stately 12 knots. This, in addition to general age and lack of utility in a modern fleet engagement, meant the British were something at a loss as to what to do with her. Luckily for Avarov and Greek national pride, they decided she was worth at least some service. In this case, operating in the Indian Ocean on convoy escort duty. Slow and worn out as she may have been, Avarov was still powerfully armed and decently armored. For the purpose of seeing off Axis raiders, which were generally armed merchant cruisers, she was quite sufficient. She would have definitely suffered had any modern cruisers or destroyers turned up, but that wasn't really a credible threat in that theater of the war. She spent the remainder of 1941 and most of 1942 on this duty. Before she could begin this, though, she suffered a breakdown of her oil sprayers in July 1941, coupled with several of her boilers being outright inoperable, and you can probably see how this is going. This reduced her already slow speed to a very slow 9 knots, not even sufficient for convoy escort. Emergency repairs got the sprayers running again, and the cruiser up to speed, but she would be chased by these engine problems for some time to come. It eventually got to the point where she was put on patrol duty of convoy routes, instead of actually escorting the formations. The worst case would come, however, in January of 1942. On a gunnery training run, she fired an 8-gun broadside. It fractured the mounts of 2 of her functional boilers, which promptly crashed to the deck and caused some pretty serious damage in the process. While she was being repaired to something resembling proper sailing shape after this, the British promptly named her Georgios Averof, which on the one hand, British wit and frustration. On the other, wow, that's an insult to this ship in particular. Ignoring that, though, she set off again in November 1942, though still only capable of 12 knots. The British Admiralty, evidently tiring of having to keep repairing the ship, but also unwilling to put in the work to properly bring her up to spec, relegated her to Suez Canal guard duty at this point. She would remain there until 1944. At which point, on October 17th, she returned to Athens under the command of her old admiral's son. As flagship of the exiled Hellenic Navy, Avarov carried the Greek government in exile to the recently liberated Athens, where she would begin serving as fleet headquarters. Her fate after that? Well, she would remain as fleet headquarters until 1952. Decommissioned from active service at that point, she would remain in port until 1983, serving as a stationary training ship. It would be in 1984 that the Greek government and navy decided her historic value was far too great to justify sending her off to be scrapped. As a direct result, she would be restored as a museum ship, a role in which she remains to this day. In common with USS Constitution and HMS Victory, she remains a commissioned warship, albeit one that isn't going sailing around. Most of the time. Because, in 2017, Avarov entered dry dock for maintenance and would, in turn, be towed to Thessaloniki. She would, after 7 weeks there, return to her more normal berth, where she remains to this day. Avarov, the last armored cruiser, had a long and fruitful career, even if her Second World War service was quiet and riddled with mishaps. She was the only armored cruiser to see out both world wars in her original configuration and role, more or less, and remains a commissioned, if only ceremonially, warship in the Greek Navy even now. Not bad for any ship, don't you think? Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.